The rhythmic clicking of spinning tape reels was the only heartbeat Arthur felt comfortable with anymore. He sat in the basement of the crumbling radio station, surrounded by thousands of forgotten recordings and the thick smell of dust and aging magnetic tape. Once a world-renowned sound engineer who could balance a symphony with his eyes closed, a tragic lab explosion had left him with a permanent ringing in his left ear and a soul that preferred the silence of the archives. To the young DJs upstairs, he was just the ghost of the basement, a shadow in a cardigan who emerged only to fix a broken microphone or replace a faulty cable. It was during the late-night broadcast of the midnight hour that Arthur first heard the crack in Elena's voice. Elena was the station's youngest host, possessed of a voice that sounded like smooth honey poured over velvet, but tonight, the honey was thin and brittle. As Arthur monitored the feed from his basement workstation, his high-end headphones revealed details no one else could hear. The shallow, jagged intake of her breath, the slight tremor in her lower register, and the muffled sound of a heavy door slamming in the studio above. His instincts, honed by decades of analyzing sound waves, told him that this wasn't just exhaustion. It was the sound of someone living in a state of constant, quiet terror. The source of that terror was Julian, the station's new lead producer, a man whose ambition was as loud as his expensive cologne. Julian viewed the station as a ladder to be climbed and the staff as rungs to be stepped on, and he had taken a predatory interest in Elena's career. From the shadows of the hallway, Arthur watched as Julian loomed over the young woman, his hand resting too firmly on her shoulder, his voice a low, oily murmur that made Elena flinch. Arthur felt a dormant fire ignite in his chest, a protective rage he hadn't felt since before the accident, but he knew that a direct confrontation in the office would only get him fired and leave Elena more vulnerable. Arthur began to use his unique access to the station's aging infrastructure to conduct a silent, technical war of protection. He rewired the studio's intercom system so he could hear every private conversation Julian forced upon Elena, documenting the threats and the verbal abuse. He used his knowledge of acoustics to tune the studio environment, making sure that whenever Julian entered the room, a low-frequency hum would begin to vibrate, causing the producer an inexplicable sense of anxiety and physical discomfort. It was a subtle, invisible haunting, a message sent through the very airwaves that this was no longer a safe place for a predator. One evening, while Julian was out of the studio, Arthur climbed the stairs and entered the booth where Elena sat staring at her reflection in the dark glass. He didn't offer a grand speech. He simply adjusted her microphone with the steady hands of a master and handed her a small, handwritten note. "The world deserves to hear your true voice, not the one they are trying to force upon you," the note read. Elena looked up, her eyes wide and wet with unshed tears, seeing for the first time that the ghost of the basement was actually a guardian who had been listening to her pain when no one else would. The tension reached its breaking point on the night of the station's 50th anniversary live gala, a high-stakes event with major investors in attendance. Julian had planned to use the broadcast to announce his promotion, while secretly planning to fire Elena immediately after the show to cover up his harassment. He didn't know that Arthur had spent the last 48 hours in the crawl spaces of the building, bypass wiring the master control board and setting a digital trap. As Julian stood before the main microphone, ready to deliver his self-serving speech, Arthur sat in the basement, his scarred hands hovering over the faders of a hidden mixing desk. Just as Julian began to speak, Arthur flipped a series of switches that redirected the audio feed. Instead of Julian's rehearsed lies, the speakers in the ballroom and the radios of thousands of listeners began to play a crystal-clear recording of Julian's private threats against Elena. The audio was so sharp, so undeniable, that the entire room went into a stunned, icy silence. Julian froze, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized his own voice was being used to destroy his carefully constructed mask. In the basement, Arthur closed his eyes, focusing only on the perfect clarity of the evidence he had captured. Security was called, and the investors, horrified by what they had heard, demanded Julian's immediate removal from the premises. In the chaos that followed, Elena stepped up to the microphone, her voice no longer trembling or brittle, but strong and resonant with a newfound power. She thanked the audience, thanked the station, and then, looking directly at the security camera that fed down to the basement, she thanked the man who reminded her how to breathe. Arthur watched the monitor, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek, feeling the weight of 15 years of silence finally begin to lift. In the months that followed, the station underwent a radical transformation under new management, with Elena becoming the face of its most successful program. Julian vanished into the legal system, his career a pile of static, while Arthur remained in his basement, though the door was now always left open. He started a small school for sound engineers, teaching them that the most important part of the job isn't the equipment, but the ability to truly hear the human heart behind the noise. He found that while he might never regain the hearing in his left ear, the music of the world had never sounded more beautiful. Elias, as he was now often called by his new students, became a legend in the industry, not for the records he had engineered in the past, but for the lives he protected in the present. He taught his pupils that sound is a weapon, a shield, and a bridge, and that those who control the airwaves have a sacred duty to the truth. Elena visited him every night after her show, bringing him a cup of coffee and sharing the stories of the people her voice reached. They would sit in the quiet archive room, surrounded by the spinning reels, two survivors who had found their harmony in the most unlikely of places. The radio station's tower still stands tall against the city skyline, a beacon of light in the darkness that continues to pulse with the rhythm of honest stories. And whenever a new intern asks about the old man in the basement, the veterans of the station speak of him with a quiet, profound respect. They tell the story of the night the static cleared, and the truth rang out like a bell, reminding everyone that even a broken ear can hear a cry for help. Arthur's legacy is no longer found in the gold records hanging on the walls, but in the freedom of every voice that speaks without fear across the frequencies. The basement is no longer a place of hiding for Arthur. It is a laboratory of light and sound where the discarded things of the world are given a second chance. He spends his days restoring old tapes, bringing the voices of the past back to life for the people of the future to hear and learn from. He has learned that grief is just another kind of distortion, and that with enough patience and love, any signal can be cleaned and made beautiful once more. His hands are still scarred, and his hearing is still damaged, but his spirit is finally tuned to a frequency of peace that no explosion could ever shatter. Julian's replacement was a woman who valued the art of the broadcast as much as Arthur did, and she ensured that the station's archives were modernized and preserved. This allowed Arthur to step out of the shadows more often, sharing his vast technical knowledge with a world that had nearly forgotten the importance of analog warmth. He became a consultant for grand theaters and concert halls, but he always returned to the basement of the old radio station by nightfall. It was his home, his sanctuary, and the place where he had rediscovered that some things are worth breaking the silence for. As the years pass, the legend of the Velvet Voice and her silent architect continues to inspire those who work in the world of media and sound. They are a reminder that the most powerful stories aren't always the loudest ones, but the ones that possess the integrity of the truth. Elena continues to broadcast every night, her voice a steady companion for the lonely and the lost, always knowing that Arthur is listening from below. Their bond is a symphony of respect and shared history, a melody that plays on even when the microphones are turned off and the station goes dark for the night. The skyscraper of sound remains a testament to the night that justice was found in the vibration of a wire and the courage of a man who chose to hear. Arthur often looks up at the red light on top of the tower, glowing like a steady heart in the night sky, and smiles to himself. He knows that as long as there is air, there will be sound, and as long as there is sound, there will be a way to find the light. He is no longer a ghost. He is the foundation upon which the music of the future is built, a master of the invisible world who found his greatest masterpiece in the act of listening.